panel or the last webinar of our speaker series of this year of the University Seminar on Europe Since COVID-19, which is co-organized by Catherine Kleppinger, Hope Harrison, and myself. I'm Hilary Silver, Professor of Sociology, International Affairs, and Public Policy at George Washington University, and I'll be today's moderator for our discussion of From the Frontlines, Migration to Southern and Eastern Europe since 2015. And so our topic today examines what's happening to migrants at the front lines of Europe. After a surge in arrivals in 2015, both Hungary and Greece were propelled to the center of Europe's migration debate. Hungary effectively closed its borders. It built a wall. It detained and expelled migrants who made it through. And it adamantly is refusing to accept more refugees. And it's presenting itself as a bulwark against invading Islam. Meanwhile, Greece has established camps on its islands to hold the ever-increasing numbers of newcomers who come by boat from both North Africa and Greece. Not only has movement across Europe's external borders largely ceased, but since the COVID pandemic, internal movement across national borders in Europe has largely stalled, which is casting doubt on agreements like the Dublin rules for asylum applications and the Schengen Agreement for open borders. So the EU Commission has been unable to establish a consensus on mobility, but it has proposed a new European Pact for Migration and Asylum. This pact aims to resurrect solidarity among the 27 member states and ensure shared responsibility for new arrivals. And those of you who are interested in the pact, we held an entire webinar on it earlier in the semester, and you can turn to our webpage to find the recording if you're interested in the details. Now, key players in these developments are Greece and Hungary. The former is one of the Mediterranean ring of frontline Southern European states that first encounter migrants arriving by sea. The second is led by the most vocal of the Visegrad group, which includes Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, that is resisting asylum seekers or any responsibility even for repatriating them. So while the EU is trying to break this stalemate, we're getting reports about pushbacks on land, including through the Balkans at Croatia. We're hearing about pushbacks by Frontex at sea, and relations with neighboring sending countries, especially Turkey and Libya, are still tense. So today's webinar is going to consider the lessons that we're learning from the great continuing migration to Europe, and we'll assess the positive and negative aspects of the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, with special attention to two regions, Southern and Central Europe. Our speakers today are migration experts well informed about these regions. Anna Triandafilidou received her PhD from the European University Institute in 1995, and she's held teaching and research positions at Surrey, LSE, the CNR in Rome, the European University Institute for 5 years, and the Democritus University of Thrace. She was a Fulbright Scholar in Residence at NYU in 2001, and a Colston Fellow at the University of Bristol after that. She serves as a national expert to almost every council you can think of dealing with migration, from OECD to the European Research Council, the European Commission's research framework programs, the European Science Foundation, ministries, and the like. And she's been consulted by the European Parliament on high-skill migration most recently. Now, Andras Kovacs, and she's at Ryerson, she's a professor now at Ryerson University. Andras Kovacs is a migration expert and the operative director of the Budapest-based NGO Menedek, the Hungarian Association for Migrants, established in January of 1995 as a civil initiative. It aims to represent international migrants, that includes asylum seekers, migrants, immigrants, and other foreigners in Hungary, to the majority of society and to promote their social and cultural integration through targeted programs and projects. Anders Kovács is also the Assistant Research Fellow at Institute of Minority Studies of the Center for Social Sciences at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, where he teaches on international migration and integration at various higher education and other training courses. And he's currently studying the formation of the new Hungarian diaspora in the UK, which is now outside the EU. So that'll be interesting. Just two technical points before we get started. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our university seminar website, together with recordings of our previous webinars. I will put that URL in the chat. Please put your questions in the chat. And now, without any more introduction, we have Anna. Anna?
Well, thank you very much, Hilary, for the introduction and for inviting me to the seminar. It's wonderful to connect. And also with Andres, that we know each other from Europe, and we're just trying to figure out whether we only have connected, via email in common work or also in person, even though the in-person these COVID days is becoming more and more distant. Actually, it's been 2 years. I'm based at Ryerson as Canada Excellence Research Chair on Migration and Integration, but I'm very pleased that the invitation of Hilary gave me the opportunity to kind of get some dust off my work on Southern Europe, and particularly on Greece and the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, that we all know has attracted quite some attention already. I'll quickly share my screen. So here we are. Sorry, let me see. I have the ambitious aim of trying to kind of give us a little bit of a perspective on what has been happening in Southern Europe in relation to the Mediterranean emergency, and try to invite us to reflect critically about how the situation has evolved and what is happening now, actually, particularly in Greece and also in relation to the EU, because I think there are some important new developments. So I have just included here some of the older graphs that we had from the International Organization for Migration, just to remind us of the size of the flows back in 2015 and 16. You probably remember, if you had followed already at the time, this is probably the first migration and refugee emergency where we have such detailed data and actually live, updates of those maps. So you can see that in 2015, we had nearly 800 people. It says 800,000 people. It says arrivals, but actually the reality is they were going through Greece, coming from Turkey, going through Greece, taking the so-called Balkan path further west and north. And of course, we had significant arrivals in Italy too. And the situation continued also in 2016 until mid-March 2016, when the EU-Turkey statement was signed between the EU and Turkey. So we might say that about 1 million people went through Greece during that 1 year between early 2015 and March 2016. I think it is important to remember the measures that were taken soon after that. It became clear that the flows were significant and there was a need of extraordinary measures, because I think there was a good deal of policy innovation at the time. First of all, the relocation quotas, the emergency relocation quotas, you will remember that they were implemented between September 2015 and September 2017. There were 160,000 positions, of which, if I remember well, about 40,000 were for Hungary and 60,000 for Greece, but they were not fulfilled. The reason being, I think, partly the shopping lists that the destination countries were giving of wanting specific types of asylum seekers, but also partly to, of course, to delays and bureaucratic complications at the level of the arrival countries like Greece. A second element at the time was the hotspots. Actually, the hotspots is an approach, is a process rather than a place. but they have actually, I mean, one might say that the camps in the reception and now detention camps in the Greek islands are hotspots as locations, because that's where you should be processed. And there is a lot to be said about whether this was a good approach. We have had, soon after the emergency, the creation, the transformation of the infamous Frontex into a full-fledged European Border and Coast Guard agency with over 10,000 of staff. The UNAVFOR-Med was again another, I would say, innovation that continues to this day, and it included, you know, combined NATO naval force that was an you know, joint EU and NATO naval force that is patrolling the Mediterranean, mainly for search and rescue missions, but actually, as we know, it's also for deterrence effectively. The EU-Turkey statement, I don't think I need to say a lot, and we can discuss it in the debate. We need not forget, it's no longer hidden in the headlines, that the EU-Turkey statement was accompanied by the EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan, which included 3+3 billions of funding towards mainly civil society actors to help with the reception and integration of Syrian refugees in Turkey. And while this was a package of, I would say, innovative policy measures that try to create a comprehensive approach in dealing with the Mediterranean refugee emergency, I think one other agreement that is often forgotten, because it was a bilateral agreement, was the one struck between Italy and Libya in the summer of 2015, because after the EU-Turkey statement, the flows from Turkey to Greece were significantly reduced, but then the pressures moved towards Libya, even though these two flows are quite separate, because the flow from Turkey is mainly Syrians and Afghans, while the flows from Libya are mainly people from sub-Saharan Africa. But it is true that we see these communicating containers kind of thinking, what was this agreement for me? And that's another thing to discuss and consider with the benefit of hindsight, is whether while the EU-Turkey statement was not the desired solution, it was probably for me before a red line. So because Turkey, with all its problems, is a country where there is a government, where there is some security, where there's been a lot of solidarity on the part of people. An agreement struck with Libya, that was really an agreement with basically the warlords, the gangs that were smuggling migrants, which were turned through this agreement into border guards and into people taking, how can I say, looking after the detention centers in Libya. And it kind of legitimized the pushbacks and the deterrence of stopping people in Libya. And this agreement was effective, and it was struck by a center-left government. So there's a lot there to be said also about the politics of it. Now, looking at the more recent time, what we see is a certain pressure continuing, although declining. I think the numbers might be a little bit small in my graph to see, but you can see 188,000 is the total flows in 2017, then 128, nearly 150 in 2019, and 100,000 in 2020. Probably there we see the impact of COVID as well, and closure of borders and disruption. And we have only 18,000 people crossing in the early 2021 until the 7th of April. So what we see is that pressures continue, but the flows are much more moderate. What you can see in this graph also is that the pressures have receded in Greece, while they have increased in Italy and particularly in Spain. That was not, that had not had a lot of pressure in 2015-16, which again reminds us of this idea of the communicating containers that we had seen also in the late 2000s, in 2007, 8, 9, 10. Now, taking a closer look at Greece, I think it's important to keep in mind the data and have a realistic view of what is happening in Greece. So right now we have 121,000 people from what I call the Mediterranean. So the 2015-16 refugee emergency that have So people that have remained in Greece. This includes people who arrived in the early days and have not been relocated, but also it includes the continuous trickle, if you want, of people arriving through the islands or through the land border. Continuously, people have been moved from the islands to mainland Greece in order to decompress the islands, even though, as you know, the EU-Turkey statement actually was based on the idea that people who arrive stay there, and actually, if their claim, I mean, Syrians are returned if it is found that they're not in danger in Turkey, and others could be also returned, for instance, Afghans, since Afghanistan since 2017 is considered, many parts of Afghanistan are considered safe areas. In my view, that's very debatable. It was actually very interesting for me also to find out, looking at the more up-to-date data, that the current government in Greece, which is a center-right government, a conservative government with, I would say, rather anti-immigrant and anti-refugee views, has done more to decompress the islands than the previous one that was a center-left government with much more clearly, at least in their rhetoric, pro-immigrant and pro-diversity views for Greece. I also give there, you can see some more data about the size of Greece and the size of the migrant population. TCN stands for third country nationals, because I think it's important to see the numbers in context. Now, another interesting element in the more recent data is that we see that Afghans account for more than Syrians, and there is a significant flow of people from the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you know, Congo has been in turmoil in recent times, so it is logical that we have more asylum seekers. It is less logical to think that asylum seekers from DRC would go through Turkey to Greece. But I think that probably testifies also to the hardship and the dangers that are involved in when people try to cross through Libya to Italy, and the danger of the journey, because the Libya-Italy sea journey is much more a deadly journey than from Turkey to Greece, where the distance is small. And we see a significant number, more than half of these people are women and children. And actually, this is an element that continues since 2015 and 16, a high percentage of minors. Now, of course, when we say children, it can be children like under 12 years of age, but it can also be children in the sense of 15, 16, and 17-year-olds, and a significant number of unaccompanied minors, which are usually boys. So I think what the recent developments to highlight in terms of, with regard to Greece, and very important, are the standoff with Turkey of March 2020. For those of you who have followed those developments, Erdogan at the time, the Erdogan government really instrumentalized migration or refugees, threatening the EU that it would open the border and flood the EU with refugees. And of course, that happened at the Greek-Turkish land border. I think the reaction of the Greek government, I'm really myself torn apart. I mean, a little bit torn on what to say, because on one hand, there was a point in showing to Erdogan that he could not instrumentalize refugees. At the same time, it is true that the whole game was played on the backs of refugees that were mistreated on both sides of the border. And of course, there was also a mediatic play taking place where Turkey was trying to accuse Greece for beating up refugees that tried to cross, and Greece was trying to show that Turkey was actually busing people from Istanbul and elsewhere to the border. And I'm afraid that both stories are true, and that's what I said, really the victims. And also there was a lot of confusion in the media debate because the word migrants was used, and particularly with regard to Greek TV that I also watch from Canada, there was very much in many of the channels, not all, there was very much a warlike vocabulary shown, as if the refugees were invading Greece. And I think that's very bad also in driving public opinion. And you will remember also at the time COVID has happened, people were under lockdown in most places. So there was a lot of conspiracies, going around about what is happening, and a heightened feeling of threat. Going a little bit forward, COVID has been putting a lot of pressure on all countries, and again, refugees have been paying the price, because when there were outbreaks in the camps, the reaction was to close the camps to contain the outbreaks. And of course, at the same time, Greece interrupted the asylum processing in March and April because of the standoff with Turkey. So there were further delays. People are desperate, particularly in the islands, because many of them have been waiting for several months, if not a couple of years, in very bad living conditions. And I think what is most driving despair is the uncertainty of what will be the outcome. So there was this deadly fire in Moria camp in September 2020 that really destroyed the camp. Now, I think perhaps one might say that was not a bad thing to destroy such a camp. At the same time, people were really left in an even worse condition. To a certain extent, there was, as I said, a secondary positive thing that the government, actually that pushed the government to further move people from the islands to the mainland, where the situation is much better. The other thing to note is that since 2018, there have been reports, independent media reports from Amnesty and from Human Rights Watch. There's been illegal pushbacks, both at the land and the sea border with Turkey, which I think further testifies on one hand to a bad practice of Greece that we had also in 2009, 10, 11, 12, but also bad practice of Greece in the context of instrumentalizing refugees in the Greek-Turkish relations. Here you can see some data on asylum applications in Greece. I think what is to remain in mind is that we have really a decrease in asylum applications in 2020 because of the temporary interruption of asylum, and also to see that in both 2019 and in 2020, Afghans are more numerous than Syrians, and the third nationality is Pakistanis, which also shows a long-term trend in Greece, which was to use asylum applications as a way of a temporary kind of permit, because while your application is processed, you're living legally in the country, you're residing legally in the country, as a way of a kind of temporary work permits when people are desperate because they don't have any other options for migration. Now, also because I'm being conscious of time, and I'd like to hear Andra's presentation, to say a few things about the EU Pact and the position of Greece, I think is important, because I think what we can see is that the solidarity mechanism and the EU Pact, to some extent, is welcome, because it shows that the EU really wants to engage and be proactive with managing migration and asylum. On the other hand, what is negative is that the idea of doing away with the first safe country principle has not been upheld. And while in 2016 and 17, there was the idea of doing away with the Dublin regulation, now this is back with the effort of creating a kind of long-term resettlement mechanism. But there is a lot to be debated, and I don't want to take more time, but we can discuss it, about whether this proposal for relocation, for returns and sponsoring returns instead of taking refugees is a viable mechanism. It's as often, the EU mechanisms are based on consensus and really heavy in its implementation. I think, however, we see, which is important for Greece, is that it has the rhetorical backing from Europe. You will remember Ursula von der Leyen going to Greece in March and saying, Greece is the shield of Europe, using also this war metaphor. And also that for Greece right now, because of the really aggressive tactics of Turkey through the Mediterranean and generally in its geopolitics within its whole region, but also both south and east and towards Libya, for Greece, the geopolitical backing of the EU in its Greek-Turkish relations and in the question of Cyprus is much more important. And somehow the refugee issue is lost within there. And this is my view, why pushbacks really are kind of tolerated right now, and there's not much debate about them. The other element that we see both in the Greek and the EU policy is the solidification of the fast-track border procedure. What is interesting in the EU Pact, and we'll have to see how it is implemented, is that there are exceptions for minors under 18 years of age and for families with children under the age of 12. That's, in my view, very important in terms of human rights and in terms of protecting vulnerable people. The question is to see how this is implemented. There is hope also in relation to the creation of a full-fledged European Asylum Agency that will replace the European Asylum Support Office and will be operational, and we have a bigger budget, because what we have seen in the last 10 years is Frontex, the European Coast and Border Guard Agency, raising its budget 10 times, tenfold, and EASO raising its budget like maybe 50%, twofold, and without a real, how can I say, a real power. And the other element that we've seen is a provisional extension of the so-called Facility for Refugees in Turkey, which is the 6 billion euro facility that was inaugurated in 2016, with another nearly $500 million for 2021. So that remains to be seen. Thinking forward, because I think that's more important, is that I think Greece needs really a plan for integrating the people who are there, not just its long-term migrants that are not related to the Mediterranean refugee emergency and are settled in the country, people mostly from Southeastern and Central and Eastern Europe, but also these more recent arrivals, protection of minors, which is a big issue, processing the backlog of asylum cases. And I think what is more important is a proactive approach, a national plan, because Greece so far has always been dealing, it's been 30 years now, it's been dealing with migration in kind of a reactive way. Oh, something happens and we have to fix it, we have to create a patch. And I think we know migration and asylum pressures will continue. The world is mobile, the world is unequal, and we really need a national approach. And I will leave it at that and look forward to our discussion. Hilary, we don't hear you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anna. And well, these muting. And next we'll hear from Andras Kovacs. Please, Andras. About no more than 20 minutes, please.
Cheers. Yeah, thank you, Hilary, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today and to share a few thoughts about more or less the same topic, but you will see the perspective is slightly different. First, I'm just digging up my slides to share with you. Can you see that now?
It's good.
Cheers. So as it was introduced, the focus will be Hungary now, and thanks to Anna, she has explained much of the context I'm going to build on, but I'm also trying to give you a little bit of a storytelling what has happened since the big wave of irregular migrants reached Europe and the southern and eastern countries of the European Union. So the whole story starts with 2015, at least as we tell you, where in Hungary we were experiencing an enormous, rapid increase in the number of asylum seekers combined with irregular entries. It's very important since the very beginning. Actually, there's been this dual talking about asylum seekers, but at the same time talking about, well, irregular, or as it was used by the government rhetoric, illegal immigrants, later on transferred or transformed into immigrants as a shorthand reference to whatever happened there. What was characteristic of that time that there was a significant transit migration, meaning that people entered the country, asked for asylum, but usually left Hungary within a couple of hours or a couple of days maximum. This is not a novelty. Actually, the Hungarian asylum system had always experienced similar phenomena. That the majority of asylum seekers arriving in Hungary moved on into other European countries. And this is where the first big issue came up. And I think this is very important, and it's been important since 2015, and it was important even before that date, that the Hungarian asylum policy has always been very much concerned about the situation of the Dublin system and the application of the Dublin system, which is the mechanism through which the European countries decide which country is responsible for processing the asylum application. And I mean, it's more complicated than that, but the main rule is that it should be the country where the person first entered the European Union. And I mean, Hungary was probing into that system during the summer of 2015 to see to what extent it can expect people being returned from Germany, from Sweden, from other Western European countries in case the country lets them moving on. So actually, I was around during that couple of months in 2015, closely working together with police units providing social services to people entering and moving on. So I saw it from within that initially the aim was to apply the asylum system to retain and contain people as much as possible, and letting them go only if there is a clear indication that Dublin won't be applied. And actually, that was the response. So initially, Hungary was, as I said, probing the system. It tried to suspend Dublin unilaterally, saying that it won't be able to receive returns from Western Europe, but it didn't work out diplomatically. Then the next move was, interestingly, that it tried to send people back to Greece, even though that since 2011. The Dublin mechanism was suspended vis-a-vis Greece by other European member states. It was customary. Nevertheless, Hungary tried to probe into that. In the beginning, it said yes to the voluntary part of the relocation quota. However, and that's already very important and interesting, it said a firm no to be qualified as a frontline country. Just as it was the case with Greece and Italy. So the initial European idea was to support these three countries, which had a very, very significant arrival. But it was already clear by the early summer that Hungary will go on its own regarding the solution. And that was the time when the so-called physical and legal border closure started, and it unfolded in the subsequent years, which resulted in a very complex and huge border fence along the southern border of Hungary. You can see parts of it in this picture. It also later on resulted in a very restrictive system of transit zones through which people could enter, and only through these people could enter the country during a very strict screening procedure. Also, since the summer of 2015, Hungary was openly and vocally obstructing all the emergency measures and all these, what Anna was referring to, creative measures the European Commission and also the member states initiated in order to manage the crisis. I mean, probably the most remarkable, I will touch upon that, was the refusal of the mandatory share of the relocation scheme. And alongside that, and I won't elaborate much on that today unless you ask me explicitly, it was followed with a very targeted and very vocal communication campaign, which mostly targeted the domestic audience, so Hungarian voters, Hungarian citizens. Besides that, and it's also important to emphasize that Hungary started to build up, I would call them alternative forms of humanitarianism, but again, with a relatively vocal communication behind, which manifested in resettling Venezuelan and Pakistani Christian refugees, investing into foreign aid schemes, which is labeled as Hungary Helps. You can see there are big programs running in the DRC, in Iraq, or in Syria most recently, helping communities there, and already vocalizing the ultimate message, which is keeping migration, keeping irregular migration outside the EU's external borders. So this is a very simple message, but this is what Hungary keeps saying in policy talks and negotiations. Actually, this picture here is a billboard poster commissioned and also communicated by the government. So this is not a political party poster, it's a government poster, which was kind of ubiquitous in Hungary just before the 2018 parliamentary elections. A few words about how the whole thing worked out, looking at from the numbers perspective. If you look at the number of asylum seekers, you can clearly see that there's a huge upsurge in 2015. The figures running up to almost 180,000. And actually, this is not the ceiling. The number is so because the system virtually collapsed at the end of August. So there was no registration after the end of August. Altogether, it was over 400,000 people that moved through Hungary during the year of 2015, but as the result of both the physical and what is called the legal border closure is basically a set of very restrictive measures regarding asylum seeking and asylum applications, together with a continuously prolonged state of crisis. It is not a state of emergency per se, it's like a somewhat lower measure of state of crisis, which has been in place since the autumn of 2015, prolonged in every 6 months by the government. So it resulted in a very dramatic drop in the number of asylum seekers. So it went down by 2018, it went down to less than 1,000 per year. And most likely it will remain so, or it's even less, because recently there's another layer of emergency or extraordinary measures used or applied on the pretext of the COVID emergency. So it is virtually impossible to ask for asylum within the territories of Hungary. The only way of submitting an asylum claim is to submit a preliminary request for submitting an asylum claim at one of two Hungarian consulates. One is based in Belgrade, the other is based in Kiev in the Ukraine. So basically, these are the two channels. It's been in place actually for more than a year, and since then, I'm aware of 5 individuals, a family of 4 plus an unaccompanied child who managed to go through this channel. Yeah, and if you look at the figures of humanitarian or international protection granted, then what you see that these are not really following the number of asylum applications, which has been a tendency or a trend for the past 2 decades. The number has always been around 400, 500, 600 per year, whatever happened. How despite the number of asylum seekers, it is partly because of the secondary movements, and partly because, but it's more like my own interpretation, that there is a certain cap on the capacity of the RSD system. However, what you see here, that there is a big peak in 2017, which is an interesting backlash or side effect of the application of the closed detention-like transit zone system. It is the result of people not being able to move on to other European countries, so they were forced to wait through the asylum procedure. And as you can see, that the authorities were also, they were not forced, but they could recognize the significantly more people as refugees or beneficiaries of subsidiary protection. And yeah, issue, and this is what I find important, the relocation scheme, because the debate around the relocation scheme resembles a lot of the present position vis-a-vis the new pact. Hungary was very, very firmly against the scheme. It even went to court, so it tried to turn it over through the European Court of Justice together with Slovakia, but eventually Hungary failed, and there is already a second ruling saying that that Hungary was not complying with otherwise mandatory, obligatory European law. Nevertheless, during this time, Hungary managed to completely avoid the compliance with the relocation scheme. Interestingly, Hungary is not the only country that relocated either 0 or almost 0 people. So alongside Hungary, it is Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria, and interestingly, Slovakia, who was going to court, but after the first court decision, started rapidly applying the measures, resulting in relocating, I think, maybe 15 or 16 individuals altogether. Nevertheless, it managed to get away with it, and right now there is no infringement procedure, and there was no court ruling against Slovakia, unlike Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, and Hungary. And actually, when it comes to the new pact, basically Hungary's argument is the same as it was in case of the relocation scheme. The main issue here in the debate is the sponsorship scheme, what Anna already mentioned. Hungary finds it a too narrow and too risky interpretation of solidarity, namely that you can swap relocating asylum seekers to sponsoring governments to return those people whose asylum claim was rejected. Orban keeps his position very clear and again very vocal, and this is basically what has been the message since 2015, that no one should be allowed to enter the territory of the European Union unless the person is chosen, unless the member state explicitly decides that the individual is eligible to enter, which is a very harsh and very fundamental interpretation of asylum, and very clearly pushes towards the extraterritorial solutions that have came up in the past, and these are pretty much in the agenda or on the agenda of the Hungarian government. And actually, the other thing is, which is a more pragmatic argument, that there are fears. And funnily, actually, what the Greek position was, and what has been very vocal, and just a month ago there was a summit of 5 Mediterranean countries on the occasion of the EU-Turkey negotiations. Nevertheless, what they vocalized was that they're also afraid of not being able to have people relocated from their territories. And interestingly, what Hungary is concerned about, that even though they would join into the sponsorship schemes, eventually they would be obliged to take over those people who are otherwise not returned to their countries of origin. And I mean, this is only summing up, so I probably won't read it out. Just touch upon the issues which characterize the present situation. That on one hand, the asylum system has been absolutely dismantled, but despite the government's promises, there is no alternative system that can equally protect the borders and comply with the European law and comply with international humanitarian and human rights standards. As a consequence, there has been a series of court ruling infringement procedures against Hungary since 2016, I would say. But despite all these, there hasn't been any improvement in the asylum system. So it is again very apparent that however much Hungary is being condemned, the result is, the pragmatic result is not a shift towards the desired way of operation. Rather the opposite. The reaction is usually an even more and even more explicit tightening on the system. Yeah, regarding Hungary's position, it is ambiguous. It's still very vocal, but I mean, there are signs of gradual isolation from its political allies. Nevertheless, it seems that the country's leverage is still pretty strong when it comes to debating or contesting proposed asylum or immigration measures. And there is one more thing which I want to highlight, that one may imagine that Hungary has become kind of a closed, isolated, sealed off country with no migration whatsoever, with a very high level of xenophobia. But actually the truth is almost the opposite. Since the very same time Hungary started to campaign against the common asylum system, there's been an unprecedented level of regular immigration into Hungary. Student immigration has grown threefold. Labor immigration has gone up fourfold since 2015, and this is clearly an apparent contradiction. And I mean, these are images you can find on the internet trying to attract either students or workers or sometimes foreign investors into Hungary. And that's my last thing, which are just a few thoughts about possible areas of debate. But I mean, it's now really up to Hillary whether to go along these or to come up with other questions. And I also encourage the audience to join in the discussion. Thank you.
Exactly. So thank you so much, Andras. So everybody out there, if you have questions, would you please put them into the chat? And while I'm waiting for you to do that, let me ask just a couple of very quick questions of follow-up to our two speakers, and hopefully you'll be able to speak to one another at the same time to compare these two regions. So one thing I was hoping is you might talk about how Greece's response is comparing to that of Spain and Italy, and perhaps even France, in terms of its detention, its processing of asylum seekers, the regularization, bringing people from the border into the country while they wait. So if you could compare the reception of Greece to Italy and Spain. And likewise, in Central Europe, I'm hearing a lot about the urbanization of Slovenia and other countries, which suggests that if throughout the Visegrad 4 cooperation, you mentioned today Austria as well, the question is a demonstration. If Orban, who is sort of the front man for authoritarianism, if he gets away with flouting the EU rules, others in the region may think they can do that as well. So I was wondering if both of you could reflect a little bit about how Greece and Hungary are their position on refugees and migration, how they compare to other frontline states in their regions.
Should I start?
Sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think what strikes me is why through these years and even before in the late 2000, in 2009, 10, 12, how is it that Greece has now forged more alliances with Italy, Malta, and even Spain? if anyone wants would like to do a genealogy of these pressures, we start with 2006 in the Canary Islands. 25,000 people arrive in the Canary Islands, and there is a kind of like this graph in terms of how the pressures move from the so-called Western to the Central to the Eastern Mediterranean flow and back again, even though the countries of origin and transit differ. And that, of course, speaks to the to how we should strategically deal with the flows and adopt much more comprehensive solutions. I don't think there is a big difference, to be honest, at least between Greece and Italy. I would say Spain is different because it had a long pause in terms of migration pressures between, say, 2000 and late 2000s and a couple of years ago. So it had a 10-year kind of pause. While pressures were relatively high in Italy and Greece and moving between the two. Unfortunately, we see an externalization of clearly of the border control and of migration asylum control. We see a conflation of migrants and refugees. My own view is, of course, that the flows are, it's not that they are mixed in the sense that a migrant and asylum seeker travel together. They're mixed in the same person. The same person may have a strong political security motivation and a lesser economic motivation, or vice versa, a stronger economic motivation with security concerns or violence concerns as well. And that's the big challenge right now for policy. I would say that Italy has given some more innovative solutions. One solution that I am personally looking at with a couple of colleagues is the permit on humanitarian grounds. So for instance, Greece has a permit on humanitarian exceptional grounds. The aim of this permit is mainly to provide, to give status to people who have been in Greece for a long time, have had status at some point and lost it. In Italy, in recent years, this permit has been used to give status to people who have been going through Libya and who are not prima facie refugees. So people who don't come from countries ripped by conflict, but who have experienced very significant abuse, torture, hardship, impact on their mental and physical health. And this has been very much a grassroots, so to speak, initiative from judges and lawyers, using also a court of cassation decision that was given importance to the efforts that this person, the asylum seeker that was initially rejected, has been doing to integrate in society. So for instance, in Greece, we have nothing of this sort. At the same time, I think what I said, the geopolitical dimension is very important for Greece, and Greek-Turkish relations stand in the way of creating a more, how can I say, long-term and compliant with human rights obligations, asylum and migration policy for what concerns the flows that come through Turkey. A third thing which relates to Hungary is that I can see some commonality. Hopefully in Greece we've been spared. The right-wing party that was growing in influence has now lost its influence and has been delegitimized. So we've been spared that kind of right-wing populism, at least provisionally. But there is something to be said about two nation states that have a very strong ethnocultural definition of the nation, a very strong feeling of being unique. Even the Hungarian, the Greek language as being unique and different from the Latin or the Anglo-Saxon languages, a very ethnic conception, an irredentist nationalism in the past with minorities abroad. So unfortunately, I think the citizens, and Andres, correct me if I'm wrong, the citizens are very prone to this kind of instrumentalization of migration.
Yeah, got it. That's a very good point about both countries having a sort of proto-fascist past that, it's susceptible to this kind of populist response. Yeah. What about you, Andras? Do you want to say a few things about the neighboring states before we turn to questions from the audience?
Yeah, very quickly, just a few thoughts. Maybe I would just start with what Anna finished, that I mean, these type of ethnocentric and very often contested national boundaries, which can give a very strong impetus and fuel to harsh and restrictive migration and refugee policies, very often by themselves are the obstacles of forming regional or transnational alliances, because sometimes these nations have disputes or conflicts of interests with each other. I mean, what is a very clear example in case of Hungary is Austria. On one hand, on the level of political inclination and interpretation of the common European measures, Hungary and Austria are pretty much on the same side. But when it comes to, I mean, everyday technical management, sharing an internal Schengen border, having a relatively significant immigrant population. I mean, Hungarian immigrant population in Austria, there are many practical everyday conflicts through which they can't really be on the same platform when going for solutions or alternatives. The other thing, the other problem of Hungary with forming strong alliances with other three Visegrad countries, that none of them has the same level of exposure to, for instance, irregular migration or large number of illegal migrants as Hungary had, or Hungary would have if it dismantled its present restrictive system. So neither Slovakia nor the Czech Republic was hit by the 15 crisis. Poland has a very different type of immigration issue with the Ukraine, with ethnic Poles, and with asylum seekers from Russia and former Soviet countries. So it is very difficult to be on the same platform. You can do that, but I mean, as we saw it in the past, that none of these countries has gone as far as Hungary did, and very often, just as it was the case with this lawsuit together with Slovakia, they last minute they backed out from joint political actions. Of course, I mean, right now there is again a formulating alliance vis-a-vis regarding the European this new European Pact. But again, I mean, I personally don't see, I mean, how far these countries would go together with Hungary in its quote unquote freedom fight.
Okay, got it. So we have a question first from our colleague in political science, Kimberly Morgan. And she asks, is the unfortunate lesson from the EU's response to the 2015 to 16 refugee crisis that agreements with problematic foreign governments is the way to solve the problem from the EU's perspective? In future crises, isn't this what we would most likely see? That you'd get more of these types of agreements, even if they're with the warlords in Libya or governments that are less than respectful of human rights. Now, this is the externalization piece of the new pact for migration and asylum. You want to talk about that, both of you?
Yeah, just very briefly, I was writing in the chat. Yeah, I think we're going to see more of those. The question is, where do we draw the red line? So we said, in my view, as I said, I think maybe the EU-Turkey statement is not desirable, but given the political climate at that moment, it was kind of a necessary evil. The Libya agreement is non-acceptable because we know, I mean, what is happening there. You cannot work, I think, with, and this is not to accuse Libyans and Libyan ethnic groups, but we know the situation. I mean, this had become a way to make economic livelihoods in Libya, but through abusing and torturing people, which there's no way that IOM or UNHCR can make those camps human. I mean, we're struggling to make the reception camps in Greece and in Italy and in Hungary and in Serbia acceptable. I mean, we cannot hope that in Libya this will happen. At the same time, I think what we need to see is that the EU is clearly engaging on more fronts since 2015-16. And that is most welcome, I think, because there should be more of a conversation that migration is not a border issue. You cannot deal with it at the border. But I like very much the questions that you raised, Andras, in your last slide about with regard to the quotas and the extent to which we need to have, I mean, even, doing away with Orban and his rhetoric, to think more interactively about what is the overall relationship. Like you were saying, now Hungary is receiving more migrants, but still the public opinion does not see those migrants and the asylum seekers as the same kind of people, and also looking at the experience and history of the country and how we can build on that to create better asylum systems.
What about you, Andras? When we spoke at one point, you mentioned that because Hungary has closed the borders, that there has been a push towards Serbia and through the Balkans, that again, at the borders of the EU, that there's an externalization that's taking place?
Yeah, very much. But I mean, there are two things here. The one is that I think we can't, or the member states can't save that that negotiation and that discussion to come to terms with each other in terms of responsibilities, in terms of potential, in terms of capacities to contribute to solutions to humanitarian crisis. The Hungarian example showed it very well. It's like a showcase that you close one border and then the flow is diverted towards other countries, and then those countries apply either close borders or apply other measures. So it's like it's an endless game, but it seems like a zero-sum game here. That at the end somebody suffers, and I mean the higher the stakes are. I mean, on our slides about the deaths in the Mediterranean, these are clearly, I mean, what's going on in Libya is clearly related to what's going on in the southern borders of Hungary or the Bulgarian-Turkish border. So this is one thing. And the other thing is that even, I mean, in case of sub-optimal agreements or pragmatic agreements, I think what is very important, and this is what the EU tends to forget, that once you fix a situation in the short term, in an emergency situation, then you tend to forget that there is still there are things. I mean, you need to fix it in the long run, and you need to make it into something that is sustainable and that is along the standards. So, for instance, the EU-Turkey deal is gradually, slowly becoming something like normalcy, business as usual, everyday operation. And actually, what happened at the Greek border last year is a very good indication that, I mean, the whole thing is very, very fragile. Nevertheless, maybe there are big schemes in the back rooms to substitute it with something else. But usually, what happens is that if something works in the short term, then it remains in place and it becomes institutionalized and it becomes everyday practice. And I think this is what we shouldn't give in to.
Andras, there's one last question for you in particular from Lila Roldan Vasquez, who says that you've mentioned that the Hungarian consulate in Ukraine was one of the strategic points in the process. And she's wondering if there's good coordination between the two governments on this, if there's a significant number of migrants who stay in Ukraine, or, I mean, right now, Ukraine is the center of the universe because Russia is sitting on its border. So I'm just wondering, is there anything going on there?
No, not at all. I mean, the reason is much more prosaic, that basically Serbia and the Ukraine are the two neighboring countries that are not EU member states. And I mean, the concept of Hungary, that Hungary can receive asylum seekers only from countries that are outside the European Union. So this is why they appointed these two consulates, but there hadn't been any previous talks and negotiations with the respective governments, just as it was in the case of building the border fence with Serbia. So this is not a bilateral development.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. So that was our last question. And I want to thank everybody who has stayed with us past the 11 o'clock hour. I want to thank our two speakers who've been really conformed to time and so informative. And really the comparisons, I think when we think of the front lines of Europe, you know, you don't hear the voices of the smaller countries so often. And so we wanted to provide greater attention to the two border regions where there have been significant challenges with the new migration since 2015. So thank you so much for your contributions. This webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to refer back to both the presentations and the slides. And please join us again next year. We're hoping that we can continue our discussion of Europe since COVID-19. We're hoping to have a discussion at least of the German elections, which are going to be in September, and then the French elections later in 2022. And plenty more to come on migration.
Let's hope it's going to be post Europe, post COVID-19.
I hope so.
Europe and the world post COVID-19.
Yes. Well, I hope it'll be post COVID-19, but at least for now, it's since COVID-19.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you all
for coming, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Now. Thanks for the invitation.
Very good.
Bye.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye.
Bye.